Is it horror time? I think it's horror time. Any time for me is horror time. But unlike my previous ventures into the genre, which were either high-budgeted romps or timeless literary masterpieces, I'm looking at the indie scene this time and what they're able to produce. My introduction to World of Horror is solely because of Super Great Friend, a quintessentially quaint YouTuber that everyone should watch, and his Demo Friend series. Guy's been going on for 13 years and hasn't dipped in quality.
Alright, I gotta get out of this hallway because there's a rifle Shibito there. So I could not follow the trophy guy. However, I do know the trophy guy is gonna run. Here he is. You get over here. He's down. I'm gonna take this. This is an archive item. It's also a weapon.
Watching the hour-long video, I was intrigued by what the game was going for, a roguelike with RPG elements centered around Call of Cthulhu-like gameplay ideas. I've never played the tabletop, closest I've had would be Betrayal at House on the Hill, but me and cosmic horror go together like chocolate and peanut butter.
I mean, I am a protoplasmic mass whose bodily container shifts and morphs for all eternity, never satisfied on a singular shape. My life is true suffering.
I also like RPGs as they are by far my favorite genre of game, and roguelikes, though my extent with those types of games isn't as expansive as my history with RPGs. Though one is easier to record than the other, especially since I have weird quirks when it comes to playing RPGs, and the length of the gameplay tab for this video speaks volumes as to why I don't cover them often. I'll be upfront with this information, World of Horror is still in early access. Thus, this video will probably be out of date come whenever more updates for World of Horror are released. To give a time frame for what version of the game I'm talking about, this is 0.9.17, also known as the Occult Capital of Japan update. Noteworthy patch notes for 9.17 was the rework of the timeline system, making certain investigations have different endings depending on which timeline was taken, and the inclusion of 2 more difficulties. Very easy / story and skeptic, and something truly evil's personal punching bag and harbinger of doom. That's very hard if you're wondering, but now I'm getting ahead of myself, so let's first talk about the developer of World of Horror, Vinsauce. Real name Paweł Kuzminski, the Polish developer didn't originally start off making games, instead being a part-time dentist in his home country. However, from a young age, Paweł had an interest in the horror genre. This stems from his teenage years, as an interview Paweł did for Engadget reveals that he was introduced to many important horror icons, such as H.P. Lovecraft, through Michael Cox's anthology book Top 10 Horror Stories. Lovecraft would serve as a major inspiration for the cosmic horror and fear of insignificance prevalent in World of Horror, but the author wasn't the only one fueling Paweł's imagination. As famed Japanese mangaka Junji Ito, don't mess with dentists, they know your nightmares, would play a heavy part in the creation of World of Horror's setting and incorporation of body horror. While surfing the web, Kuzminski stumbled upon a scanlation of the Enigma of Amagari Fault, and as per the words of the interview, the final panel was seared into his memory. Indeed, that ending alongside the movie Jaws would form Paweł's horror style of not completely giving the full picture. You see just enough details to see what's going on in the scene, but you have to fill in the blanks yourself, Paweł explains to Jess Condon of Engadget magazine. And this goes without saying, as I've already brought up Junji Ito, J-horror, both mainstream and obscure, holds a clear dominion within the game. Wanting to use a program that could best obtain the hidden horror look that he wanted, Vinsauce looked towards MS Paint, as it would force him to get creative with his work. It also matched the manga/comic feel he wanted to simulate. What's perhaps the funniest part about the history of World of Horror is its reasoning for coming into existence. One of Paweł's favorite activities, at least I'm going to assume that as I don't personally know the man, was tabletop games, particularly board and card games. I enjoy board and card games. It was a natural progression of things for me to try and make my own. As playtesting and constantly putting new versions of the cards became too tiresome, I decided to port everything and make a PC game out of it. The simple card game started evolving and growing into the world of horror that you can now playtest yourself, as stated by Paweł in a Q&A for Dailydead.com. This card game idea wasn't thrown away for the... It's not a final product because it's still in early access, but I think you get what I mean, as all the items within World of Horror have a card aesthetic having a front, a back, and descriptive text. Likewise, on the earliest itch.io thread for the game, Paweł mentions that he intended the game to be on mobile platforms where there are a large number of card-based games. A small demo for the game was released in 2016/2017, though I can't say what was in it, followed by another one in 2019, and this one featuring 3 scenarios. Spine-chilling story of School of Scissors, far-out fable of a fear festival, and chilling chronicle of a crimson cape. And though some sources say the game was purchasable in that same year, presumably on the itch.io page, the Steam and GOG versions of the game give February 19th, 2020 as the day the game was put into early access. That seems so long ago. Switching things up a bit, I'm using the GOG version of World of Horror, though sadly I don't have any lines to a Polish information network. In the year 1980X, not as cool as 20XD6, strange goings-on are happening in the Japanese city of Shiakawa. Cultists are making their presence known while missing persons reports keep piling up. That's not even the worst of it, as foul creatures far removed from humanity are prowling the bay. Even technology itself is proving to be corrupted by an otherworldly force, the awakening of the old gods. Whatever cult has infested this seaside municipality, they've managed to jumpstart the end of the world. Shiwakawa will be the epicenter to the reemergence of either Chithak Odarasu, the spider god that only knows hunger, Ithotu, the devouring flame responsible for the destruction of the Library of Alexandria, Athiolazith, the towering eye dead set on consuming earth, Goizo, the thing forsaken by God whose true shape is unknown, or Yogathag, the irresistible gaze capable of controlling the weak, unless a band of brave individuals stands up to the cult and shuts their plans down. To do this, our heroes must solve at least 5 mysteries plaguing the port, which include, but are not limited to, stopping Akuchi Sakiona from turning the town's high school students into Joker lookalikes, shutting down a Red Room, searching for a missing gardener who was last seen using an experimental fertilizer, finding out where the sailors of the town are disappearing off to, locating some tapes tied to a missing documentary team, attending a vigil of a dead uncle, preventing classmates from daring Akamantu, partaking in a local town's odd festivities, determining who committed a murder in a local apartment complex, hampering a janitor's plan of making a mermaid by using real women, figuring out what the secret ingredient is at a newly opened ramen shop, identifying some strange fish that have caught the interest of a friend, unearthing what really happened at a haunted house, and pinpointing the source of a string of comas. Only when 5 of the total 14 enigmas have been dealt with can our bunch climb Shiwakawa's lighthouse to put Takashi-san in his place and give humanity more time on the clock. As even if the awakening ritual stopped, the end of everything is inevitable. I definitely stretched it a bit for story summary, but that's not to say that there is a small amount of writing in the game. Reading is what you'll most be doing within World of Horror outside of dealing with the various nasties that want you dead and hoping to your own personal god that you'll pass a skill check. It's not cookie cutter either, fitting right into the cosmic horror genre amongst the usual suspects. Despite me giving a general outline for all the investigations that happen within the game, each one of them has a multitude of endings. These range from our heroes probably fending off whatever horror for the day to failing drastically, such as being booted out of the Red Room in Bloody Brief to reviving the dead uncle in Violent Vigil. That's not even counting the game overs, as dying to stamina, reason, doom, and certain bosses unlocks an ending. Granted, acquiring an ending that isn't a game over, even if it has negative connotations, doesn't affect the overall narrative of stopping the cult outside of giving the player another key for the lighthouse is a tad weak, but I understand that this is a game made by mostly one person, so having a grand story with divergent paths that change the lighthouse encounter is out of the equation. World of Horror is all about its flavor text, as practically everything in the game has a tidy description that is imaginative. Whether it be from enemy attacks listing out what they're doing to you, to the endings providing varying scales of accomplishment, the writing is not afraid to go into detail. It's also not afraid to draw from a multitude of sources and implement ideas in different directions. Botany, for example, has Shiro-san be the actual villain, the mutated plants trying to stop the player from escorting the facsimile as its existence is unnatural. We get the Little Shop of Horrors impression, but also bring in a bit of The Last of Us. Hey, I'm not shitting on that game for once, as I like the idea of the clickers, with the plant-zombie hybrid. In an effort to not drag this out like I did with the recap, I'll say that the writing is good and gets me into the horror mood, which is praise in my book. Talk about a blast from the past. You wouldn't be mistaken for thinking that this is an MS-DOS game on the surface, though there are definitely effects that World of Horror is using that I'm pretty sure would set an older computer on fire. However, World of Horror draws more from fellow indie game Dusk when it comes to recreating an art style than it does with Fez, as the choice to use MS Paint graphics, as explained in the History tab, was a deliberate design decision by Powell. Keeping to the primitive style plays up to the unknown terror that he was going for, as well. For a lot of the events the player can see the whole picture, many of the minuscule minutiae is lost to a sea of shadow and ill-defined graphics. eyes. Is there actually a set of eyes staring at you from across the hall, or is it only something in the shape of a pair of eyes? Maybe the teacher is quite friendly, or perhaps she's a horrid abomination in disguise. The mind is something that can be tricked both for good and bad. Speaking on the general graphics, there are 1-bit and 2-bit modes in case you want a splash of color, and the way this game does screen modes is so neat. Playing full screen means that your monitor will be used for the game, but there is an option for computer in computer where the game is on a computer screen on your computer screen. It can even be zoomed out even farther so you can see the room of the person playing World of Horror while you yourself are playing World of Horror. Talk about breaking the fourth wall. Share screening the game would mean a computer screen streaming World of Horror while you are playing World of Horror as the unseen character in the game is playing World of Horror. Or if a friend is using Parsec, why am I bleeding from my ears? What's probably the best part of the presentation is what I will call the page turn. A hallmark of Junji Ito's works, the page turn is essentially the build-up to the horror before it's revealed by turning the page. Since games aren't books, the way that Powell uses this device is by having the screen go to black with a description of what is attacking the player before immediately cutting to the encounter. Helping with this effect is that the music slows down, making it obvious that something is wrong. Character designs, though basic, each have a tinge of personality to them, making our cast of playable characters not boring stand-ins. What helps is that they show damage. Let stamina get lower than 10, invisible scars start showing up. For a reason, the lights in the character's eyes fades away. That's not even adding up to the various curses and injuries that can be applied to the characters, such as cursed marks branded onto their faces to burns ravaging their bodies. Events each come with their own CG art, and like with the writing, there is a surprising amount to sift through. Horror is in the title of the game, so expect to be appalled by what you'll be looking at, but in the good way. For as big up as I can talk about the art style and the care that was put into it, the UI is a bit of a cluttered mess. It's like a D&D or Call of Cthulhu character sheet has been placed into the game, and while this is probably a conscious effort by Powell, seeing as World was to originally be a tabletop game, it's not exactly great to look at. It doesn't help that there are a ton of menus to switch in between, and it's all kind of redundant. Doom is always shown on the top of the game screen, but Doom also gets its own menu tab. Why? An Old God's effect will always be an ongoing thorn in the player's side during every run, so it's not like they need a refresher on what their Awakening God does. Luckily, this is the only low point for the presentation, as the music brings it right back up to a high. Wanting to continue to embrace that old DOS style, the music within World of Horror is chiptune, and impressive at that. While there is a small pool of it with some investigations reusing certain tracks, it honestly sets the atmosphere for what the investigation is going for. Seaside incorporates the sounds of the tides to put the player in the mindset of being near the ocean and witnessing the horrors that might come from there, while Forest starts off with a low piercing drone, a sound that I'd picture what 1 to 2-bit cicadas sound like, before giving way to a cacophony of madness. The forest has come alive to the player's presence, and it's telling them to get out or suffer its curse. Music tracks, all of them, are also divided into 3 parts: investigation, encounter, and combat. I say this because there aren't proper rips of the encounter tracks, which is when the music slows down, and that's a shame because I don't care if they are short and slowed down loops of the investigation track. They are great at building tension. The variety when it comes to the enemies is another highlight of the presentation. You'll never truly understand what you're fighting at times, but that's what makes it downright chilling. I was just minding my business walking down the beach, then all of a sudden I'm being jumped by what appears to be a barnacle growing off a man's head. What about the anatomy horror stalking the hospital, which is somehow a ghost, adding to the list of growing questions I probably won't get answered unless I don't favor my sanity? It's all topped off with the bosses, and while some are quite ordinary, others are downright esoteric, such as the large Otaru who has an inner ear-like spiral shape on its body, to even quite humorous, together being the player's personal computer trying to kill them. World of Horror is a punishing roguelike RPG where the player tries to solve investigations to stop an awakening god before their stamina or reason gives out on them or before the god awakens, dooming everyone. My breakdown for this section is going to be a bit unconventional, as instead of jumping right into the gameplay by going over the controls, I'll begin with the starting screen in World of Horror. Game type. Clicking New Game gives the player 4 options: spine-chilling story of school scissors, extracurricular activities, quick play, and customized playthrough. Spine chilling is the tutorial of the game, as it plops the player right into the investigation and tells them to get a feel for the game. The only character the player can play as in this mode is Koji, so its only real purpose is to introduce the investigation and the general gameplay. Extracurricular activities is an expanded version of the tutorial, tasking the player with completing 4 investigations as Aiko. Both game modes, once enough time has been spent learning the ropes, are superfluous. Quick play is considered one half of the standard game mode. Unlike in Customized, the only options the player can choose, which are located on the sidebar of the playthrough screen, are combat, difficulty, and timeline. Having brought them up, I'll cover what each does. Combat changes how dying works. Normally, it is set to last stand. A run isn't over when a character's health stats hit 0 during combat. Instead, the game gives the player a fighting chance. Health stats can drop as low as -5 in an encounter, with a player surviving if they manage to kill the enemy before those stats drop below that threshold. Surviving with negative health does mean the player has to recover before doing anything else, otherwise they will die at the start of the next event/encounter. On the opposite end, sudden death kills the player whenever their health stats drop below 1. Difficulty determines how easy or hard a run will be, no duh. But do take notice that World of Horror is a roguelike. The genre itself is built on making the best of a bad situation, so it is possible to wind up losing a run to bad RNG. Difficulties included are Skeptic, Initiate, Cultist, True Believer, and Harbinger of Doom. Skeptic is very easy, giving the player 21 stamina and reason and 5 funds while weakening enemies and balancing skill checks more in the player's favor by lowering threat level, which isn't really noticeable as failed skill checks still occur often and their negative effects aren't hampered. Initiate is the same, but enemies hit like they do on Cultist. Cultist lowers the health stats to 17, gives the player 4 funds, and raises the threat level, making skill checks harder all around. True Believer drops health to 13, provides no funds, but doesn't augment the threat level. Lastly, Harbinger of Doom keeps the health values, gives the player 5 funds, keeps the threat level of True Believer, but makes the enemies harder to deal with. What difficulty you play is up to your discretion, as I don't care how anyone chooses to play a game as long as they're not trying to dictate others or the developers about game difficulty. As such, I mostly stuck to Cultist and Initiate. To top off the difficulty discussion, certain achievements are unlocked by completing the game on specific ones, and some unlocks are only possible on select difficulties due to the amount of RNG and stat drain. Timeline affects certain investigations and provides new endings for them. In Timeline A, the player might not have to fight a boss at the end of an investigation, while one might exist in Timeline B. A way of clearing an investigation might be different as well. Quick Play randomly gives the player a character, a backstory, an old god to deal with, and 5 investigations to clear. I rarely choose Quick Play, and that's because of how much is left on the cutting room floor when compared to Customize. I consider Customize the standard game mode as it brings everything the player has unlocked into one playthrough. Clicking on Customize first takes the player to the card shop, once again drawing a line to that board game idea. Here, the player can add or remove expansion packs, which add different events and enemies to the run. Most of the standalone expansions have to be earned through achievements, though everything that a player has gotten through that system has its own expansion set. After finishing up at the shop, the player is then taken to the seed generator. Seeds act like how they do in other roguelikes, providing a different experience every time, but there are specific seed codes that cause special events to happen. The game's intro then plays, and after it, the player is free to select their character, difficulty, backstory, and tweak other settings such as randomizing item stats or prioritizing new content. As of right now, update 9.17, there are 9 characters to choose from. Each character has their own flavor text, a dominant stat, a regressive stat, and a unique quirk. Some start off with an item, spell, or ally, while others have whole mechanics tied to them. Sussing out which character to use is up to the player, as while basic gameplay is standard for all of them, you still do skill checks, fight enemies, and solve investigations. Each character has a focus that they mostly want to stick to. Difficulty I've already explained, so I'll move to backstory. Backstory, like with the old gods, adds a modifier that changes up certain parts of the game. There are only 6 backstories as of 9.17, so I'll go a bit more detail into them. World of Horror is the basic backstory that applies no special features. Medical history starts the player off with a healing item and extra experience, but taking damage can cause an injury. Hunted by the Cult awards the player with more doom reduction after completing an investigation, but the downside is that cultist enemies are now in play and there's a unique event that sacks the player for doom. No lie, this backstory and the next one I'll go over are the only ones that matter after all the achievements tied to the backstories have been unlocked. Seventh Curse gives the player more money at the start of a run, but they can't recruit allies. Doing so will cause a bolt from the blue to strike down anyone you attempt to get on your side except for dogs. Knight Errant gives the player the inspiring novel, giving +2 to damage for the current mystery, but forces the player to get ending A for each mystery unless they want to take a hearty 7% doom penalty. The last of the backstories is Ill-Fated, where no matter what the player chooses, every skill check will fail automatically if an event has one. That means choice-based events that have set outcomes won't harm the player, but those don't make up a majority of the events. After fiddling with the settings and clicking next, the player will then have to choose a specific game mode. Classic or Endless, as Scenarios hasn't been enabled yet. Classic is the vanilla game mode of solving 5 investigations, while Endless is survival mode against Doom, Stamina, Reason, and a plethora of events. There are no investigations to solve in Endless. Picking one of the 2 modes sends the player to the god selection screen. There are 5 gods to pick through: Yugatheg, Ch'tak Amaterasu, Ithotu, Ath-Yolazif, and Goizo. Yugatheg makes it so that exploring certain locations incurs a doom penalty. Ch'tak makes running away from enemies impossible. Ithotu raises everyone's combat damage across the board. Ath replaces a spell's reason cost with doom, though some spells do get around this, such as the stamina ones and specialty spells like Ithotu Flame. And Goizo makes resting cost more doom. The breakdown is that Ath and Yugatheg are the easiest, Goizo is in the middle, and Ch'tak and Ithotu are the hardest. Selecting a god finally drops the player into the world of horror, but before we begin, let me break down the stats. The 3 most important are Stamina, Reason, and Doom. These are the 3 health stats. Certain events, whether skill checks or not, perks, healing items, and resting typically replenish 1 to 2 of these stats, mostly Stamina and Reason. Failing a majority of events and taking damage lowers these stats. As said earlier, letting Stamina and or Reason drop to 0 while out of an encounter kills the player, but so does raising Doom to 100, and unlike either Stamina and Reason, once this stat gets to full, even when in an encounter, the run is over. Lowering Doom is a lot harder than raising it, and will most likely be the source of some of your runs ending as Doom is given to the player for basic actions: resting, investigating a location or visiting a shop, and failing events. A set number of enemies also specialize in dealing Doom damage. The only ways to lower it are by finding hard to find healing items like the Occult Book, giving up Stamina, Reason, or money to the Monument, choosing certain options and events, and clearing investigations. Though I've made Doom doomy, it's not as aggressive as I'm making it out to be. These core stats aren't the only ones that have to be managed by the player, as there are 6 others: Strength, Dexterity, Perception, Knowledge, Charisma, and Luck. Understanding these stats isn't hard, as every skill check measures one of these stats against a dice roll, with modifiers such as threat level being thrown in to adjust the calculation to see whether the player passes or fails. Every weapon is based on a stat, with the higher the stat is, the faster the player is able to attack with that weapon and the more damage it deals. All but luck is shown to the player, and luck skill checks are rare that having a high amount isn't necessary. A golden rule for stats is that 8 is the bare minimum each stat needs to be, as passing the final skill checks in the Lighthouse requires stats to be at 8. The last attributes measured by the character sheet are funds and experience. Funds are earned in a few ways, such as passing events, selling items, or exchanging experience for money at the police station. Experience is gained for clearing mysteries, investigating with the compass equipped, winning fights, and passing some events. All but Yasuhiro needs 100 experience points to level up. He needs 140 to do so. Leveling up allows the player to pick a perk, which range from shared like Outdoorsman and Quick Thinking, which increase a stat and provide a third option to some events, to character unique ones like Fast Swimmer or Ammo Stash. Prioritizing character perks is the way to go, though a player only gets a selection of 3 perks when leveling up. Rerolling is an option, but it costs Doom to do so. After picking a perk, the player gets a point to spend on a core stat or give a +5 to maximum Stamina or Reason. Choosing to give +5 also heals that stat by 5, so sometimes emergency healing from a level up is the way to go. Lastly, on the main screen, ammo and cigarette amounts are listed. Don't worry about these too much, as only really Morocco and Harder deal with these counters, though when a cigarette is used, it gives an amount to the counter that dwindles down every time the player takes a turn being investigating a location. The character sheet isn't the only menu the player can look at, as there are ones for spells, allies and perks, injuries and curses, doom, and settings. Since I've been stuck on one screen for an amount of time, I'll stay there to go over city history. As more achievements are unlocked, which to be brief is the game's progression system, more shops can be opened up around Shiakawa. Only 2 shops/sub-locations can be in an area, so choose wisely. Beginning the task of solving the 5 mysteries starts off by entering your house, which allows you to change clothing, look around for some visual spooks, heal via the bath, only once per visit to home, and start an investigation. The 5 mysteries a player must solve are always randomized, so success and failure can be up to RNG. Each mystery has a few endings associated with it, though no matter what ending the player gets for one, it would be considered solved even if the problem actually isn't. Once a mystery has been picked, the player must either finish it, die, or quit out. Every mystery requires the player to investigate a set amount of locations to learn more about about what is going on before having a final event such as fighting a boss. The player doesn't have to immediately go to the locations the game wants them to investigate, as they are free to choose any location to either search, causing an event or encounter to happen and raising doom by 1, unless Yogatheg is in effect, then apply his doom before adding 1 if the rule is broken, or enter if it has a sublocation like a shop. Why would you want to do this? Either to prepare for the much harder encounters that will happen later down the line, as some events reward a pass skill check with powerful weapons, useful allies or spells, or to complete side quests. Each mystery has a side quest. Completing it generally unlocks the best ending for the investigation and awards 15 more experience points on top of the usual 30 gained for finishing up a mystery. Not to go away from talking about side quests, but other things also happen at the end of a mystery. If the player didn't rest at all during the duration of one, they are refunded 1 stamina and reason. A town effect will also be applied after ending an investigation. These range from the dog shop closing up for the rest of the run to healing at home impossible. While most side quests only require a certain location to be investigated twice, some do force the player to discard items. Events make the bulk of the game, as you probably couldn't tell, and while there are a large amount of them, some set to specific locations, others global, to truncate them, events give a player a choice and either test one of their stats via a skill check, a dice roll that I don't know the complete inner workings of, or provides an outcome based on their selection. The second half is mutually exclusive to the first, as some events don't test skills at all. However, sometimes superseding an event is an enemy encounter. Combat in World of Horror is done through a turn-based time system. Any action the player does eats into a time bar, the max amount of time being 200 seconds. An enemy's power level also determines how slow the player's actions will be, and because I can't fit this anywhere else, an enemy's health gauge determines how much damage they can take before dying. The player has standard offensive options like light and strong attacks, but can also prep attacks for perfect accuracy. Quick side note, eldritch escrescences from extraneous expanses take getting punched in the face like the Pillsbury Doughboy being poked. A weapon is most of the time better than bare fists unless your name is Haru. Guy can clobber monsters from beyond the rails of time without breaking a sweat. For as important offense is, defensive actions play a major role in combat as well. Enemy attacks are always accurate, what's with the alliteration today, and deal a set amount of damage, whether to stamina, reason, both, or doom. For weaker monsters, taking damage is fine, but getting hit for 2 or 3, sometimes even 4, does wonders for your health if you want to look like a corpse. Alternating offensive options with defensive options like dodge, which can avoid attacks completely but sometimes doesn't activate, or brace, which halves enemy damage and ignores specialty actions that an enemy might have, is the key to winning. Running away is also an option, though a doom penalty of 5 is given to the player, experience is not earned, and bosses can't be ran away from. Special encounters also have uncommon options for the player to choose. Rounding out the combat are spiritual actions and spells. Enemies are divided into a few categories, but the only ones you have to keep track of are ghosts. Ghosts can't be physically hit, instead either being appeased via money, untethered by destroying the object they're tied to, or by banishing them with a series of 5 bows and claps. Either appease, sever, use spells, or run away, as learning the correct set of bows and claps is a pain in the ass. Even though I've included spells into the combat, they are also used outside of it. Spells all have a requirement for casting, all involving health stats, and do a wide range of abilities. Some deal high damage to enemies, which is a free turn as spells aren't counted on the 200 seconds, while others heal or provide an augmentation to your character. Spells aren't unlimited as they take up spell slots, maximum of 4. Forgetting spells does heal the player for one reason, so keeping a spell for that option is a smart strategy. Items are like spells, but range from consumable to equipable and take up space in the backpack, which also has a max size of 4. Equipped items are considered out of the inventory, so if you want to stockpile items, equipping an item for more room is possible. Just be careful, however, some items have nasty side effects when unequipped, like the Crestfallen Mask. -2 on every one of my stats, and facelessness? Sign me up. Items too can be discarded, though this should only be done for side quests when that is the requirement, but they can also be sold unless stated otherwise. I know that my comment about facelessness may have seemed random, but it allows me to bring up curses and injuries. Not bracing against certain attacks, failing some events, and using certain items applies either an injury or curse. Most injuries harass a player's stats or increase action time during combat, while curses are a bit different. Not every curse has a negative effect, such as Nicotine Rush or Inzmasu Look, but curses can stack and can't be healed like with injuries, making them much more dangerous. I think the last part of the gameplay I will mention are followers. Anytime the player feels like it, they can take 2 Doom to visit the schoolyard to convince some of the students there to join them on their crusade. These basic students provide either an increase to a stat, which is good, or a decrease, meaning they must be let go of. There are unique allies that have their own abilities that are head and shoulders above the common rabble, but they are locked behind certain events or investigations. Allies can be sent at an enemy to deal damage, but it's typically pitiful amounts, and can also distract them, making the player's combat actions quicker. Allies are fragile, as if one is sent to deal damage or fails in the distraction, they die, but having a certain ritual spell applied means if an ally dies when trying to distract means the player gets stat increases. Before I move on to say the presentation or the gameplay, can I just take a minute or more to admire all the references included in the game? Because holy hell, there are so many. It's apparent that Pans Taz is a huge fan of horror, and it shows, from the more blatant homages to Junji Ito, if not only the man himself showing up in an event, but some of his creations even being enemies, such as the Whole Ridden Thing being a direct reference to the short story Shivers, to the later removed Ribs Woman, which was a reference to Ribcage Woman and has been replaced with an enemy called Ribcage Woman. Powell even makes tribute to my favorite Ito story, Yo, with the Ikidakimasu event, as the funky sushi looks like the fish machine hybrids. In turn, this event can also cause an H.P. Lovecraft reference to appear, as failing the skill check can curse the player with the Inzmasu Look, an allusion to the story The Shadow over Innsmouth. I'm not going to go through all of them, as there are a lot, but I'll list some of my favorites, as some are quite surprising. An event that can happen in the school is called Dead Man's Float, which was the name of an episode of Are You Afraid of the Dark where a corpse haunted a school swimming pool. Another one that happens in the village is Welcome to the Rice Field. Missing out the motherfucker there, but I'll include it. Inspecting the forest may yield the Trap Dog event, a nod to Resident Evil 4. Not only is the Trap Dog completely white, matching the appearance of the one seen in 4, passing the skill check to open up the rusted bear trap makes the dog an ally to the player, an acknowledgement to how the dog in 4 helps Leon with the first El Gigante if he saved it. If you want to be even more thorough, the Trap Dog event, by being associated with Resident Evil 4, has its ties to Haunting Ground, as the RE4 dog shares similarities with Huey. Though in saying this, it has never been officially confirmed or denied that the RE4 dog is an admission to Haunting Ground's Huey. Perhaps my favorite out of all the winks and nods is the entirety of Macabre Memoir of Morbid Mermaids. While the plot structure isn't the same, it has been confirmed by Powell himself that the investigation is a send up to the 4th/6th. It's a hotly contested debate due to a few factors, one of them being the director claiming he had nothing to do with it. Guinea pig film, Mermaid in a Manhole. Now you get what I meant back in Hotline Miami. The reason why I'm saying this one is my favorite is because it actually made me seek out and watch the film, a decision that I advised the weak-stomached to not do. It's body horror. Vivid body horror, where Painter uses the blood and pus from a live but rotting mermaid he found in a sewer to create her portrait. Oh yeah, and worms! Worms start coming out of the growing sores covering the mermaid as the painter gets closer to finishing his art piece, which also causes more sores to appear on the mermaid. And it's not even a mermaid, the painter only hallucinated that it was. In all actuality, the mermaid was his estranged pregnant wife, the audience only finding that out after the painter hacks up the mermaid, revealing a grown fetus and that her skin was fine. Don't you love underground J-horror? It's the best. Now that most of you think I'm a psychopath, I'll jump over to how I think World of Horror has one of the best art directions in a modern game ever. A game can look pretty, but that doesn't mean it has a good art direction. That's a key issue with a lot of games that use photorealism. This isn't me dunking on games that go for that style, as I enjoy the look of RE7 and Devil May Cry 5, but having a creative art style greatly impacts the presentation. If you don't believe me, look at Shin Megami Tensei Nocturne, the prettiest out of all the SMT games on the PlayStation 2. Not only does World of Horror base itself out of the 1 to 2-bit DOS era, creating an already uncanny vibe fit for a horror game, the art direction helps to complement this choice. Back then, graphics were ill-defined blips and bloops, forcing you and I to imagine what objects look like in a game. Here in World of Horror, we somewhat see the full extent of what we're dealing with, but there are tiny details missing from many of the things we are looking at. This keeps in mind the nothing scarier idea, as imagination will always be more horrifying than what you can actually see, but also celebrates that older era of graphical style. It's both modern, as the presentation employs tactics as seen in Junji Ito's work, such as the video game equivalent of the page turn, and retro as the presentation is still emulating DOS graphics. That's also part of the reason why I like using computer windowed mode to fully invoke this idea. Stepping away from the overall presentation, creature designs are pretty inspired. I didn't think I'd be tangling with a giant mass of arms, but here I am, wondering where the hell to look at and asking if the class of 1971 needs a hand. Bad joke aside, if I had one tiny complaint, it'd be that a majority of the roster are humanoid in nature. Granted, this is more of a nitpick because every enemy has such grotesque detail. Take the Sniffling Gardener, for example. Things that make me go, ugh. It's the eyes and the nose, man. It's the eyes and the nose. Out of all the monsters roaming around Shiakawa, though, my favorite is Totoro. He's so wonderfully goofy, but innately terrifying at the same time. The big dumb grin tells me he's a friend, but the second mouth and the rising doom counter says otherwise. Shoutouts to something truly evil in Akamantu True Form as well, as an underrated design is having something with an empty void for a face. Visually, it speaks volumes about how naturally wrong an entity is if it lacks a face. The event art is just as spectacular, my favorite CG being the ending to Abnormal Arms. Outside of the game's version of the page turn, as it's used to its best effect when the player discovers the man trapped in the vents, the detail on the pervert is top notch. Taking a closer look at him, you can spot centipedes both crawling out of his mouth and down one of his arms. It's never specified how the man came to be Stretch Armstrong, but it's a safe bet that the centipedes are tied to his condition. And that is the case for the Timeline B Abnormal Arms investigation. The blank stare is mesmerizing, as it's hard to gauge if the man died in terror or if the wide-eyed expression was because of his peeping. Either way, they really bring the visage together to create such a distinct image. I would be a monkey's uncle or a brain-dead follower of Yugatheg if I didn't bring up the most iconic scene in World of Horror, stabbing out Kana's eye. Even though there is limited animation, as a flash of white happens when you click on Kana's eye before showing the aftermath, it's visceral to say the least. It helps that the player has to actively engage in the scene, and it reminds me a bit of Gungrave's ending. If you want to save Kana, you have to do the terrible duty of poking out her eye. The scattering eels coming out where his eye once was is the icing on the cake for the scene, as it's both relieving and vomit-inducing. Closing this section out with gameplay, it captures the one more turn feel that games like Civilization have, but the best part is that I don't have to play Civilization. Coming extremely close to completing a run only to have it fall to pieces is the good kind of aggravating, as paradoxical as that sounds. Since most runs for World only last around 20 minutes, it doesn't feel like a punishment for when you die, as you may have encountered a new enemy, seen a new event, or even unlocked an achievement. There are achievements and certain CGs that are unlocked for dying, so everything in the game has a purpose. Figuring out what that purpose is part of the appeal to me. Take defeating the Rioter, for example. She always drops the prescription item when defeated, its description saying that it would be best for the player to turn it in at the pharmacy. Doing that requires 4 funds to buy the medicine, which can be taken back to the Rioter to unlock her as a character. What makes this achievement system so great is that a run doesn't need to be finished for an achievement to be filled out. It is a viable strategy to waste a run doing nothing but checking certain exploration locations to fulfill unlock conditions, as filling out the achievement screen is how the game tracks progress. Having a hard time completing an achievement? Either lower the difficulty or go into endless to accomplish its requirements so that you can use whatever was unlocked on whatever difficulty you want. Trust me, some of the items gained from the progression screen are a must for the higher difficulties, as all the perfect fighting in the world won't save you from failed skill checks draining your stamina or reason. Lumped in the game's massive customizability are the gods themselves. They all aren't pretty faces that will doom the world to endless torment of a sorts. Each provides a different modifier to the gameplay. Want an extreme challenge? Pick Chithak Odarasu or Ithotu for tougher enemies. Want some buffoonery? Pick Ath Yolazif for spells costing Doom or Yogatheg for a strange game of Fish God, may I? Only Goizo feels like the odd one out, his rule only being a hindrance on higher difficulties and if the player doesn't use items or events to heal their injuries. He does have a role for Miku runs though, but so does Yogatheg if he isn't being fickle and the events don't screw Miku over. The expansive roster of characters is another high point for the gameplay. There is someone for everyone, such as the ever-reliable Aiko, who is a master in combat, to the high-risk, high-reward play of Miku. Getting a good run with Miku is something I get extreme joy from, as typically her stats get maxed out so easily that not even the toughest of bosses can stop a crazy anarchist from dicing them up with a katana she found in an otherworldly desert. All the characters each bring something unique to the table, even for the ones that I don't care for. I may not focus on spells, as I prefer bashing my opponent's heads in with a hammer, doing Robogarda proud.
I suppose you're wondering where my gun is. Well, I haven't got one. I've got something much more effective. The product of 50 years of psychological warfare from the CIA. You see, if a Garda comes at you with a gun, you know he'll never use it. But if he comes at you with a fucking hammer, you run for your life.
Or slashing away with the various bladed weapons, but having Kirei's character be all about them is good diversity. Same with Morocco and her focus on guns. No two characters feel the same. The only character that I would argue is a bit of a lame bird would be Yasuhiro due to the faith mechanic's stringent nature regarding taking damage. He has taken the position of Haru, who was the worst character and still has problems, but he's much better due to his hard knock nature and core strength perk, providing him higher damage, offsetting his slower reaction time due to his nicotine addiction. Even though I don't play as him often, the idea that a Yakuza, he does have a Kiryu outfit if you're wondering, and there is a Bakemitai reference in the game, is punching out eldritch horrors is such a funny visual to me. Alright, Akamantu, I'll show you why they call me the Snake of Shiakawa. But saying that guy's name. No, let's talk about the fun bosses first. In particularly Takeshi-san. You'd think that the leader of a cult that wants to bring about the end of the world would be somewhat psychotic, but nope. Takeshi-san not only doesn't attack you during his fight, choosing to much rather hold you back or block your path from the lighthouse, he's also more than willing to help you. The Wired Preacher is clearly our man, and if you listen to him, he provides useful information at the cost of reason. In the Freaky Footage mystery, he's also the one to prevent the player from falling into the well if they look down without using the can of acid. He even says to the fainting player character that their dying here would be a bad thing, alluding to some higher purpose. Another boss that I enjoy is Together, solely because the player is fighting a godforsaken home computer. It's not too often someone gets to say that they smashed their computer but for reasons other than it frustrated them. Now I can talk about that thing. Motherfucking Akamantu. Need I say more? Well, I do, so I'll try my best to explain why I can't stand this cape-wearing, masked-faced fuck. For starters, there is no easy way to get out of his encounter. Scissors Woman does share this stipulation, as no matter if you botch the ritual or not, you have to fight her, but it says a lot that her stronger form, Scissors Woman Horror, is on par with Akamantu's human form. Out of all the bosses, too, Scissors Woman has the lowest amount of health and only hits moderately, having 20 health and damaging for 2 across the board without factoring in the increased enemy statistics done after investigation has been finished. All the stats that I will mention going forward from this point will be cited under this banner to avoid confusion. The only difference between Scissors Woman and Scissors Woman Horror is 6 more health, but the fight is still bog standard. Vent Crawler in Timeline B of Alarming Account of Abnormal Arms is the other boss the player must fight, and while it does have 30 health and deals 2 stamina damage, it's still a regular battle, unlike Akamantu's. See, the player has theoretically 2 choices when it comes to Akamantu's investigation. Ignore the side quest or complete it. Neither of these options are particularly great for various reasons. Choosing to ignore the side quest or doing it for the 15 experience points but not getting its ending means that during the final event in the investigation where Akamantu asks the player to select a color of toilet paper, they will receive 5 damage to stamina no matter if red or blue was picked. Depending on when the investigation is done and other circumstances such as injuries, curses, and stamina, congratulations! You just got shanked in a bathroom and you didn't even get a lousy t-shirt saying, I got killed in an abandoned bathroom stall and all I got was this bloody t-shirt. Mind you, this is the better option when it comes to Akamantu, as this one only has 26 health and attacks for 2 on the health stats. That's because fulfilling the side quest not only takes a toll on Doom, though this isn't a problem with Miku, as it's completely random when one of the students at the schoolyard provides information on Akamantu, but taking the third option unlocked by the side quest makes him stronger. Instead of facing human Akamantu, you get Akamantu True Form, who has 38 health and hits for 3 on both stamina and reason. Now, This isn't the highest stats for a boss, as Dream Devourer has 42 health and damages 4 all around, Mad Janitor has 35 health and strikes for 2 against stamina, and Shiro-san the Garden has 24 health while dealing 3 to stamina and reason, but each one of these bosses has alternate means of dealing with them. The Dream Devourer doesn't have to be fought, taking a hit to reason, and even if the player decides to fight it, the player can pull the plug on the hospital patients, dealing extreme damage to the boss. Likewise, the Mad Janitor can be killed instantly by burning down the school, the only downsides being the burn injuries applied to the player and losing the ability to recruit followers from that location. Shiro-san the Garden might be the only other boss that can stack up to Akka, but that's only if the player decides to rescue him, as the vines must hit the player for 3 damage, or kill him, as the Garden does get a pot shot of 3. It is an option to let the Gardener die, incurring a doom penalty that gets undone by finishing the investigation. There's no relief when dealing with the Bathroom Dweller, however, as it's either take 5 stamina damage and hope to beat down human Akka or reveal his true form for the hardest fight in the game. And that's no exaggeration. Akka Mantu True Form is the only boss to work around the last stand mechanic. Usually when pushed into a corner, the player can attempt some form of desperation as a final option, as Last Stand allows the player to let their health drop to -5. True Form looks at that and calls it cute, because as soon as your stamina or reason hits 0, game over. Lost in the other world. The only way to make the boss easy is by having a good run, which if that's happening, no enemy in the game will pose a challenge. Despite me saying that I don't mind Shiro-san as a boss, his investigation alongside freaky footage and household hell have my least favorite mechanic in the game. Random exploration. Death by 1,000 eels to the eye. During the penultimate event of all 3 of these investigations, the player has to search for the correct tile that will take them to the final event. Not only is it completely up to chance if the player gets the correct tile, not getting it leads to an event or fight that can possibly drain them of health or raise their doom. While I still dislike the aimlessness of household hells, the tiles are at least mansion tiles, a location that, yes, does have some of the more annoying enemies in the form of the puppet matron and the whole written thing, but only half of its events, not counting the global ones, can damage the player. The rest are either a free heal or item or can be outright ignored. Feature and Botany instead use forest tiles, where every event can potentially damage the player. This problem is tied to some of the achievements as well. There's a reason why I stated that it's best to unlock them on lower difficulties, as the RNG can be against your favor at times when going for certain unlocks. Getting Morocco and Yasuhiro can be a test of patience, as both have roundabout requirements to get, and one of them can't be unlocked in endless mode. Morocco requires the player to watch the TV until a report of her is shown, then, while having the Outdoorsman perk, investigate the forest until the Bloody Sweater event shows up. Yasuhiro, on the other hand, needs the Tiny Key, which is only found if the side quest for Timeline A Abnormal Arms is completed, forcing the player to reset until that investigation shows up in the lineup. Getting the key is the easiest part, as it's a guarantee. The rest of the steps aren't. Once the key has been nabbed, the player has to check around the school until the trophy case event happens. Using the key there gives the goblet and another round of exploring the school, or mansion or village if you're feeling frisky, for a portal to the other world. The void spell can also be used, but that's only if you have it. This is the worst part of Yasuhiro's achievement, as now it's an even riskier game of chance. There are 3 otherworld locations: the Bleeding Desert, the Boreal Expanse, and the Upper Kingdom. The Upper Kingdom has the monster blood that needs to be collected with the goblet to get Yasuhiro. Being sent to the other 2 is not only a waste of time, but energy as well. While the Bleeding Desert does have a chance for the player to get the katana, mind you, that's rolling a high perception check and being in the overworld lower stats during checks by 3. The Boreal Expanse always punishes the player no matter what they choose, as Frostbite will always be applied to the player, sapping them of 2 strength until the injury is healed. And that's only if the player passes skill checks. Failing one of them rewards the player with both Frostbite, but a random major injury. Nothing screams like a time waster than being sent to the Boreal Expanse. Speaking of wastes of time, the exercise system is not worth the hassle of using. It's safer and easier to either appease ghosts with money or attack the object tethering them instead of guessing what the correct bow and clap sequence is. The only positive is that once you figure out the sequence, it never changes for that run. please play World of Horror. It's a neat little horror roguelike RPG that has a lot of care put into it. There are definite complaints that I have of the game, such as Akamantu being the bane of my existence and the random tile selection for some of the investigations, but those are small potatoes compared to what I like in World of Horror. Almost all of the presentation, the gameplay loop and its replayability, and all the send-ups to other horror media. Steam or GOG are my personal choices for the best way to play, as the game does have an extensive list of mods made by the World of Horror community, but the upcoming /release Switch version would be another choice of mine because of portability.